at some point are advocated for. But this happens all the time. It happens all the time, and it happens because the poor don't have a voice. They weren't sitting in those rooms saying, but wait a minute, did you really do all the homework? Is it possible to bring these prices down? No one ever bothered to look. And it took us about a year to bring the prices down. The thing that was most surprising to me about this particular process was how unbelievably easy it was. So from 2000 down here to 2006, lots of countries are working on drug-resistant TB. But as our friend from Atlanta revealed, we're not out of the woods. And in fact, a little bit later, I'll tell you about an epidemic that scares the hell out of me. It's the worst epidemic that I've ever seen in a developing country. This is a graph of life expectancy. Everybody should know this graph. This is what's happening to life expectancy in Africa because of HIV. So if you look at some of the graphs, Botswana is the most remarkable. Botswana is a country that has diamonds. Their life expectancy was about 63 in 1985, and it's plummeted to 40 by 2004. So HIV for Southern Africa is one of the worst possible disasters that you could imagine. Sebastian Mallaby, a writer for the Washington Post, once wrote that people looking back at our generation are not going to ask about terrorism or the economy or even the war. What they're going to ask is, how do we let AIDS get this bad and not do anything about it? There's going to be a lot of things now, I think, that define our generation, wars being one of them. But I truly think that our response to Africa, and specifically our response to HIV/AIDS, will define our generation. Here's a set of countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, that are extremely poor. Many development specialists have written off Africa. They've said, it's just hopeless. All the countries that have already developed. Africa's just hopeless. Now, I've studied this kind of, how should we say, sort of the process by which academics and specialists write off entire countries and regions. And I would just say be very wary. In 1900, there were reports all over the place from people who said, this particular country is so backward and savage that people have no culture, they don't know how to read. The culture is just so backward that there's no chance that it will ever develop. Those people were talking about Japan. In the 1950s, they said the exact same thing about South Korea. So almost word for word, the things that were being said about Japan in the early 1900s and Korea in the 1950s are being said about Africa now. And if we don't get on top of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the prophecy may come true finally. My own sense is that Africa, just like any other country, can develop just fine. But if we don't jump on the problem of losing 25 years of life expectancy in a decade, we'll never Africa will be doomed. The AIDS story is one of the most important stories, again, of our generation for a lot of reasons beyond what it's doing to Africa. So most of you probably weren't born when the first stories of AIDS came to light. It was 1981, and in 1982 I entered medical school. We had just heard about it. We didn't know how AIDS was spread. We knew that it was almost uniformly deadly. When our medical school class, in my first year at Harvard Medical School, one of my classmates had to interview for the first year set of activities a person with HIV. And they literally put a moon suit on him. We didn't know if it was spread through airborne means like tuberculosis. We'd not even identified the virus yet. We didn't know what it was. And for the first 5 years or so, we didn't do very much about it. And what happened was activists, mostly gay white men, started taking to the streets, and they demanded that NIH focus on research for AIDS drugs. And these two people here, this is Paul Volberding and Peggy Fischel, these are really wonderful people who've worked their butts off for 25 years in trying to find drugs and other treatments for HIV/AIDS. And they'd get blood thrown on them on a regular basis. Now, I've gotten to know these guys very well, the AIDS activists. The group was called ACT UP. And ACT UP was very famous because they just scared everybody. They scared scientists. They scared politicians. They chained themselves to the White House fence. They would go into the NIH buildings and throw blood on researchers because they weren't doing enough around HIV/AIDS. But the good news is that it worked. And it worked so well, it worked so well that we started getting new drugs. And right now, the drugs are coming out at such a regular pace that it looks like people are going to live for 25, 30, 35 years with the new drugs that are becoming available now. So we've turned what was an extraordinarily frightening death sentence into a manageable chronic disease. And in 1996, when the widespread use of the so-called highly active antiretroviral therapy, the triple combination that at that time for the first time included three separate drugs that could be used in combination, we saw death rates drop precipitously. Now, this was 1998 right here, right? So in 1998, the question then was for us. So we had been treating drug-resistant TB for a couple of years, and we, frankly, were confident at Partners in Health. We thought, my gosh, if we can do drug-resistant TB treatment, we can do anything. Drug-resistant TB treatment is, I think, the most difficult thing we've ever done in a developing country. It's 18 to 24 months of therapy, and almost every day you have to give them an injectable. So you have to inject them every day. Compared to that, AIDS treatment is relatively easy, and especially now with the fixed-dose combination drugs, it's one pill in the morning, one pill in the afternoon. Nobody else thought AIDS treatment was easy, but we thought it was. So we started talking about treatment, but as recently as 2000, I mean, this was not that long ago, in 2000, people were still saying, forget about treatment for Africa. Forget about treatment for any poor country. It's just not going to happen. Protests started again. People started demanding, look, and the people who were at these protests were the same people who threw blood on people at NIH. These were people who said, we put our bodies on the line to go through all the clinical trials to test these drugs. We're the ones who really pushed the research community to come up with these new drugs. Damned if we're going to let them be used only for rich people. So they started protesting drug companies to make drugs more accessible. At about this time in Haiti, we were seeing patients like this. And this particular person came to us, was brought by his mother. And the reason that they came to the clinic was that they wanted a loan for a coffin. They thought he was going to die. This is Joseph June. He's suffering from tuberculosis and HIV when he came to the clinic. And he literally looked like he was going to die. 3 months later, he looked like this. Right? We call this the Lazarus effect of HIV care. And when we saw this in the developing countries, when we saw this in Haiti, we knew that there was something special. We knew that the before and after pictures, the notion that you can take someone almost dead and bring them to life like this could change everything. So lots and lots of activity from 1998 when we started to 2003. This is January of 2003. There was this tremendous amount of activity to push people to start treating in poor countries. But as of 2003, there were very few people on treatment. In Brazil, they were treating everybody. There were a couple 100,000 people on treatment in Brazil. And then we had a little project in Haiti. There were other little projects in Africa. But it was really this PEPFAR project that got things going. January 28, 2003, a very important date for me. He did some really amazing things on this day. On this day, he talked about treatment is $300 a year. Now, you know, President Bush has been very friendly with the pharmaceutical industry during his tenure, and this $300 a year was the generic price. And the pharmaceutical industry just about, they wanted to kill him, I'm sure, when he announced this. And then he later would announce that, well, he didn't really mean 300, you know, they were going to work with the pharmaceutical industry, and the price that they ended up paying was more like $5,000 per person as opposed to $300 because they didn't want to upset the international pharmaceutical industry. Now, this was a great day. The PEPFAR program was a fantastic program, and it still is a great program. There's a lot of problems with it that I'll talk about, but this was a very important day. Now, not everything on the speech that day was perfect. He also talked about the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently saw significant quantities of uranium from Africa, which started another process. But that day, the launching of PEPFAR was really important. And on that very day, at 4 o'clock in the morning, when I was in Boston, Lee Jong-uk, who was my very close friend, whose campaign for Director General of WHO I ran, was elected Director General of the World Health